Hey everyone, Hannah here with 446 week 4 for our summer session 1, summer 2022 class. And this week we are covering the prison industrial complex, the school to prison pipeline, and life course, which we've already been doing a little bit of work on life course stuff, especially as it relates to intimate partner violence and family dynamics last week. One thing I want to point out this week and next week, so weeks 4 and 5, you don't have any big assignments due. You only have to do your discussion board posts and your response to one classmate, but that's because you should be focusing more on your final paper. So just as a reminder, the rubric for that assignment is available with your other rubrics, and there's other resources as well on LaLima that can give you a better idea of what to include in a sociological literature review. I have a library guide posted there that covers the American Sociological Association's guidelines for writing a literature review. And then on the syllabus, there is a summary if you go up to all the assignments and where they're listed. You can see how long your paper needs to be, how many outside sources you need. Here's a link to that library guide I mentioned, which is also linked on LaLima. And then if you're struggling with a topic for your literature review and final paper, go down to this schedule here. It's on the last page of the syllabus. You can think about the topics we covered this semester. So you could do something related to classical theory, social institutions and isms, intimate partner violence and family dynamics, what we're covering this week, which is prison industrial complex, school to prison pipeline, and developmental stuff. And then as next week, week 5, we're covering gender-based violence in higher education. Now, I would discourage students from focusing on the content from week 6, which is contemporary theory and praxis, only because your paper is due on Friday, week 6, so that doesn't give you a lot of time to work on that topic for your final paper. By week 6, you should be further along in that assignment. However, if you are interested in incorporating more contemporary theory into your final paper, consider focusing on week 1 material, so that classical theory stuff, and finding a way to also incorporate some of the contemporary theory topics as well. So just something to consider. As always, feel free to email me with any questions you might have about that assignment. And you can also ask questions in the Exit Pass, the anonymous feedback weekly, if you don't want to ask something and sort of out yourself or be named. All right, so moving right along, let's go ahead and start this week's lecture. Okay, so we'll do an introduction to the topic. I'll cover some frameworks related to this topic, and then you all can give me feedback. So this is a PowerPoint that I've used in face-to-face classes where I have real students in the audience, so I'm adapting that for our online asynchronous purposes. It might make some of the wording a little strange, but that's why it says questions and feedback here. All right. I also want to point out, while I do a content alert warning at the beginning of the semester and in the syllabus, when we're talking about prison, this can be especially serious in nature. And so if for any reason you find yourself not able to finish this lecture or get through all this content because it is more violent in nature, you can always take a break, walk away. You can say, hey, I didn't finish the lecture. It was really disturbing to me. Just communicate with me so I know where you're at in terms of class material and that sort of thing. Okay. So I want to talk about some frameworks, especially because a lot of the ways in which I frame this lecture for all my classes is I talk about and build upon a lot of things we've already covered this semester. So the first thing is social institutions. Recall from week 2, I provided that sociological definition, how social institutions are things that sort of organize our everyday lives, things like family, education, politics, things like that. Now, we can also think about the criminal system and policing as a social institution. And in fact, if we think back to Irving Goffman's work on total institutions, prisons are very much total institutions, right? They control every aspect of a person who is incarcerated's life, down to the minute details of when they eat, how they eat, what food they eat, where they sleep, what time they sleep, all that stuff, right? Um, Policing perhaps isn't a a total institution, but it is a social institution because the policies we have and the way that they're enforced by police very much organizes our lives, right? So um, we're not going to break laws like driving laws or other small scale laws and policies that impact our everyday lives, not because we know that there are police officers lurking around every corner, but because it's a social institution we're all aware of, we know it exists. We know that there's potential for us to have negative consequences for breaking laws, and so it organizes our lives and the way things within our society are structured. Now, building off of social institutions and thinking about systemic violence and racism and some of those isms we discussed in week 2, you can think about race and racism, right? And how that is part of the very fabric of a lot of the social institutions within our society, and in particular, the criminal system, right? Building off that, we can think about intersectionality. So I suppose to a certain extent, that sort of flip-flops our weeks because we covered intersectionality more in depth week 1. But we can think about how all of these different aspects of identities, so race and class and gender, other aspects of identities, how they impact social institutions like the criminal system and like policing. We know that there are different prison apparatuses for men and women. We know that there are disproportionately more people of color incarcerated in the United States compared to their overall representation in our population. And then, as critical scholars, we should constantly be thinking about ways in which we can work toward eliminating some of these isms that exist within social institutions. And so, specifically, when we're thinking about the criminal system and policing, we can think about sort of 2 different frameworks. We can think about reform versus abolitionism. And I'll talk more about what those things mean throughout the lecture because they're new definitions and terminologies and frameworks we're working with in violence over the life cycle. And then finally, I'm going to end this lecture thinking through violence that's specific to the criminal system and policing, and in particular, Shatima Threadcraft's work on spectacular death and slow death, which will really get to the nuts and bolts of what we're covering this week in a lot of ways. Okay, again, just as review, thinking about social institutions and the criminal system and policing, we can also think about some other ones as well, right? So government kind of it is a social institution, and it kind of relates to some of the topics we're covering this week with the criminal system and the prison industrial complex, because our government is in large part in control of the laws that we have on the books, and that determines, who is following the rules and who's being policed and that sort of thing. Religion's another social institution, and a lot of our policies in place, especially in the United States, are based off of religiosity and our ideas of morality and what's right and what's wrong, right? You can also think about families being an important aspect of the criminal system and the prison industrial complex. And the reason I bring this up is because we can start to think about how mass incarceration and disproportionately incarcerating people of color, especially men of color, really changes the way family dynamics look in our society, especially in urban poor areas that are overly policed, right? We can see that a lot of the men who who would be heads of household are incarcerated. They're disproportionately incarcerated compared to their non-urban, often white counterparts. In terms of the economy, we can think about a lot of different things. We can think about how in a lot of urban poor areas, folks have a lack of access to legitimate forms of employment, and so they participate in the illicit drug economy and then are over policed as a result of that. And certainly this connects to the war on drugs and how urban communities were over policed during the war on drugs and continue to be over policed. And a lot of folks who research the prison industrial complex and the school to prison pipeline really hone in on that aspect of over policing and that change that occurred in the late 90s, early 2000s during the crack epidemic. Think about education. So this is especially true when we think about the school to prison pipeline. So we now have known for decades that in a lot of poor, low income public school systems, there's this mentality that the students who are in these schools are going to go directly into prison. And in fact, a lot of the folks who are attending these low income public schools, they're not even going to graduate. They're just going to matriculate not to college, like we might think about in suburban middle class areas, but into prison. And then gender is a huge component of thinking about the prison industrial complex. Now, increasingly, we know that girls and women in urban poor areas and in communities of color are being over policed. And yet, we know that men of color, and in particular on the mainland, Black men, and here in Hawaii, um, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are, these men are disproportionately incarcerated even compared to women, although certainly women from those communities are overly policed and more likely to be incarcerated compared to their white counterparts. All right, so with race and racism, we can think about ethnicity as well, right? We can think about how race and ethnicity is socially constructed within our society and specifically as it relates to crime. So if we think about crime, we know that there are a lot of subconscious biases in terms of how we as a society conceptualize criminals versus victims. And we know that within our society, when we close our eyes and we visualize what a petty theft criminal, for example, looks like. Oftentimes, a man comes into our minds, and a man of color specifically comes into mind. At the same time, folks within our society really like to make this argument, oh, we live in a colorblind society, and I don't see race or ethnicity, and folks like to really deny the fact that we have these social constructs in play that do make us think of people of color when we think of criminal, right? And so we sort of have to contend as a society with this colorblind argument. And how can we sort of say, okay, well, we don't need to think about not seeing race, rather, we need to think about race and ethnicity and how we can work to dismantle the racism that exists within social institutions. And why is it that our prison system and our policing apparatus is, in fact, racist? We can also think about colorism. And so if you think about, within the Black community, there is almost a pecking order, and there are scholars who are experts in colorism, and they examine how within communities of color, darker skin is perceived as having negative connotations. And that stems back to slavery and Jim Crow era and the one drop rule, this idea that anyone who has any blackness in their ancestry is a person of color, and therefore there's like some sort of negative connotation. And so we can make connections with colorism and the prison industrial complex dating back to slavery and Jim Crow era. And then nationalism. So this might be something that you all haven't thought of, even if you are familiar with terms like the prison industrial complex or the school to prison pipeline. But we can start to think about nationalism, especially after or sort of leading up to the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, because we started seeing a lot of conversations around borders, right? So folks didn't want people from Latin America, and in particular Mexico, crossing the southern border of the United States. And so we started criminalizing folks who were not part of the nation state that is the United States. But of course, we know that that's rooted in a lot of racism because it was only certain types of people from certain nation states that were criminalizing, right? Think about the northern border we share with Canada. Were we policing that part of the country? Not so much, right? All right. And of course, this all leads back to intersectionality. So thinking about religion, country of origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, all those things. These are always at play within all these different social institutions, and especially thinking about the isms and the structural inequities that exist in policing, in the prison industrial complex. So we can't just not think about these things, even if, for example, with the prison industrial complex, we focus primarily on race and ethnicity. Well, we also know that gender is an issue and country of origin is increasingly an issue. We also know that LGBTQ plus issues come into play when we think about the prison industrial complex. There's a whole anthology that exists about the LGBTQ plus experience and how folks within that community are even more disproportionately discriminated against within prison apparatuses. Now, there's sort of two schools of thought we can consider when we're thinking about how we can change or dismantle things like the prison industrial complex and the school to prison pipeline. So, the first framework is reform. This looks like policy change. So, here in Hawaii, during the last legislative session, there was a lot of conversation surrounding bail reform, which is a policy change. It's a reform change where folks who are poorer and can't pay their bail, they're in prison, or I guess they're in jail. They're in jail until they have been found guilty or not guilty, and then if they're not guilty, they're set free. But if they're found guilty, they are incarcerated in prison. However, their wealthier counterparts, they pay bail and they are not in jail until their court date, right? And so we see that that is one way in which we can think about reform. Can change laws, bail being one of the big ones here, especially in Hawaii. We can do different trainings. And so, as we are seeing more and more protests in the mainstream media coverage regarding high profile police shootings, including ones that have happened here in Hawaii, we see that the public is demanding for better training of police officers so that they don't shoot first and ask questions later, right? We're seeing calls for more social workers and mental health professionals rather than just, having police officers respond to these really potentially traumatic situations, right? Oftentimes, when we think about reform, this has to do with people who are already employed by and working within existing frameworks. So, insiders, this is government officials and policymakers, police officers who are sort of at the top of the pecking order, lawyers, people who work in nonprofits like the ACLU who are dealing regularly with issues of incarceration. So reform tends to be something that people who are sort of insiders pursue. Now, another way to think about making things better, so to speak, is prison abolitionism, or getting rid of the prison industrial complex as we know it. Now, one misconception with prison abolition is that this means we're going to have chaos and anarchy and no one's going to be punished for breaking the law. And that's not necessarily true. The majority of prison abolitionists believe that, there should be some type of incarceration. Probably not prisons, maybe jails. So like drunk tanks, someone is misbehaving badly and they, go in and they had too much to drink, or they're on drugs, or they're houseless. And so we put them in a jail for a few days and help them get the resources they need. Maybe that's physical health treatment, maybe that's mental health treatment, things like that. Get them connected with housing resources, stuff like that. Substance abuse resources, all that good stuff. But the prison industrial complex, this huge apparatus that incarcerates hundreds of thousands and millions of people in the United States, we would get rid of that. Because we know that it's racist, it's steeped in racism and sexism and all sorts of isms. We get rid of that. And so if you think about some high profile prison abolitionists, folks like Angela Davis, who have been calling for the dismantling of the prison industrial complex for decades now. So what would some alternatives look like? What kind of punishment would we have in a future where prison abolitionism is front and center? Well, it looks like restorative justice. So making sure that victims of crime have some sort of justice. It means more social workers and mental health workers responding to some high profile crimes, right? Making sure that folks who are committing crimes have access to community resources that they need, like housing, sort of holistic programming that we often refer to in social work spaces as wraparound services. So making sure that folks who are potentially going to commit crime have the food and the medical and the mental health services they need. They have housing, they have employment options, things like that. And then again, jail, question mark. Like maybe we do need to have some type of holding cell space for folks who are committing crime. But certainly it wouldn't look like this prison apparatus that just has this huge reach and in within our society. Now, this is a class on violence, so how does the prison industrial complex relate to violence? Well, we know that police apparatuses and prison apparatuses, they really represent a site of violence within our society, especially for poor communities and communities of color. If we think about going into those communities and asking folks, well, what do you think of police? What do you think of prison? First of all, the expectation is that the majority of the people living in that area are going to be incarcerated at some point in their lives. Then there's also this fear of police violence, right? And so if we think about all the high profile instances um, of folks who were killed by police officers, there's this ever present fear of that type of violence. Now we have scholars, Black scholars like Shatima Threadcraft, who say, well, not only can we make connections between the prison industrial complex and the school to prison pipeline and the historical context of slavery, because there's a rich history that connects slavery and all that to the prison industrial complex. And the book chapter you read by King and colleagues covers that in detail, so I won't talk too much about it. But she says there are some other connections we can make to that historical legacy of slavery. And so there in here on this slide, you see this camera. And the camera is a really important connection that Dr. Threadcraft uses in her work. So during slavery and during the Jim Crow era in the South, folks in the North like to pretend like racism didn't exist there, and they sort of patted themselves on the back for not being as racist as their Southern white counterparts. We're not lynching Black people the way they are. We're not, I mean, there was discrimination in the North, and certainly there was different bathrooms and different water fountains and things like that, separation at schools, churches, things like that. But people in the North really thought of themselves as not being as racist and not having as much separation. And they sort of it's that colorblind argument that we've talked about in this class, and so we have that, and you have a lot of white Northerners sort of turning a blind eye to the very public violent behavior that was occurring in the South, in particular lynchings. But what changed that is when cameras became more widespread. So when cameras were first invented, they were expensive. Not a lot of people had them, but increasingly they became cheaper and lots of people had them. And what was happening is in the South, where all these lynchings were occurring, people started taking pictures. And then they would send pictures of this really violent stuff happening to northern newspapers, especially ones in Chicago. And they would say, y'all can't deny that this violence is happening in our streets if you see pictures of it. And through that process, you started having white folks in the North more concerned with the very blatant violent behavior that was occurring in the South against Black people and Black communities. And they were doing something about it. And that's when we start to see in the Jim Crow era and sort of leading up to that, and in the leading up to the civil rights era of the 1960s, white folks from the North going to the South and literally putting their bodies and their lives on the line to desegregate and things like that. So Shatima Threadcraft says, okay, you have that movement that happened back in the day, but something very similar is happening in a contemporary setting with cameras. And so with iPhones and smartphones being more regularly available, even to poor folks, we now have folks taking video and picture documentation of police shootings, right? And the over policing of communities of color, stop and frisk implementation happening disproportionately to Black folks and things like that. And then those videos become consumed by a white audience through mainstream newspapers like the New York Times and things like that. And again, it's this situation where predominantly white communities can no longer deny that the Black communities and urban poor communities are being over policed and experiencing extreme violence by police officers. They can't deny it if it's being documented and shared publicly on social media and things like that. And so it's the role of the news. And back in the day, it was newspapers. Now, it's more online spaces, online newspapers, as well as social media platforms. Now, another thing Shatima Threadcraft looks at is slow death. So, on the one hand, you have Black spectacular death, where you have really violent acts like lynching back in the day, or high profile police shootings nowadays. So you have that happening, and when it's sensationalized through media outlets, she calls it Black spectacular death, because what she argues is the death of Black people doesn't matter unless it's sensationalized, unless it's spectacularized. And if it is spectacularized in the media, then it matters. And so it takes a Black person being dead and killed very violently, very publicly, for their death to matter. And she also talks about how this is mostly Black men who experience Black spectacular death, because Black women and their death very often goes under the radar and is not sensationalized and reported on in mainstream news outlets. And so we've started to see in even more recent years social media movements like Say Her Name, where women of color are saying, well, it's not enough to draw attention to the fact that Black men are dying at the hands of police brutality, but actually Black women are as well. If you think about Breonna Taylor and things like that. But then she also does something else. She talks about slow death. So there's Black spectacular death, these really sensationalized things where Black folks aren't being humanized until they're dead. There's also slow death, though, where we have communities of color, especially Black communities, that lack basic resources to food, shelter, and medicine. And so if we think about urban spaces where, transportation is an issue, getting to grocery stores is an issue, and oftentimes folks within urban poor spaces lack access to nutritional food. So they have higher rates of diabetes. They have lower life expectancy because of the lack of healthy food and the lack of access to medicine. They lack shelter. All these things contribute to the slow death of communities of color, to the point where literally, if you look at the average life expectancy and you break it down by race, white people have higher life expectancies than Black communities on the mainland. And there are some nuances here in Hawaii that I'm happy to talk to you about on an individual basis if you're interested. But so she sort of juxtaposes Black spectacular death and that process with slow death, and how communities of color are really just suffering in a lot of ways because of lack of adequate resources. Okay, so here's her work. Her book on Black spectacular death came out in 2018. I encourage you to look at her website and learn more about that. This is a program, you can watch a video on it. It's about a program at Cook County Jail, which is outside of Chicago, Illinois, which is one of the biggest one of the biggest jails in the country. And this is a gardening program they do. It's an alternative form of programming that I really think speaks to reform. And, oh, you can watch it on your own time, but that's the beginning music for it. And that is all I have for y'all. There's a little bit more information about intersectionality. Here are some resources for you, and that's all I got. Have a great week.